Chris Davey here. He's with Early Warning. He handles a lot of the product management there. Early Warning, if you all aren't familiar with it, is the software that powers Zelle. So if you've ever sent money through your Zelle account, that's his company, excuse me. So, Chris, I guess to kick this off, it's your first stadium gig, right?
Definitely my first stadium gig.
Okay, I'd be really impressed if you had more than one stadium gig.
Most definitely.
So tell us a little bit more about your background, how you ended up into software, and kind of what that looked like for you.
Sure. So I work at Early Warning Services. The founders of Zelle, we're actually owned by the 7 largest banks in the U.S., and so it's a consortium model. My role at Early Warning is running half of the business. So I lead our decision intelligence group. Today, our responsibility set is basically preventing fraud in both payments transactions as well as identity. Typically, a really common use case for us is where you're opening a new bank account. Our services are all API services that a lot of the banks will use to validate and verify your identity at the point of opening an account. So that's my wheelhouse. We've got roughly 8 products we sell into. It's all B2B, so it's all enterprise. We sell into banks across the US domestic. And prior to EWS, I worked at a company called DocuSign, which hopefully you guys are aware of, as well as Intuit. And so with Intuit, I was responsible for QuickBooks marketing, TurboTax, also ran an accountant business and globalization for QuickBooks Online, their SaaS accounting product.
So if you pay your taxes, you should know what Intuit is.
Absolutely. I hope you do. Yeah, I still have shares.
Hopefully. We're not going to call the IRS on this. Okay, very cool. So you got into software. You've been in software kind of your whole professional career. So what's your favorite part about working in software?
I think for me, it's dynamic. It's always changing. So when I started off in software, it was when there was desktop software. That's how old I am. So we used to ship boxes of software annually. We would chase people to try and get them to upgrade the software if we were trying to drive more revenue. And then I got to go through the transition to SaaS, where we moved from that non-subscription model where we were chasing renewals and trying to drive boxes of software through Costco and retailers, to then working online, fully digital, trying to ensure that once we get our acquisition funnel going, we get customers onto our SaaS product, we keep them. So ensuring that they're getting value from the product on a day-to-day basis so they don't disappear on us and churn out. So that was kind of my journey. So I've enjoyed the different chapters that software has evolved to, and obviously the next phase is going to be AI as everybody is plugged into, and kind of how that will morph and change even the dynamic with software and how people interact with it today.
Absolutely. So I want to dive a little bit into your experience with Intuit. I know that you and I have had a few conversations about what you did with the QuickBooks software and how you were able to globalize that. You said you entered 7 new global markets with Intuit. And I know that there were a lot of challenges that came with that, but how did you go from 2 to 7 is what we had talked about, and kind of what were those markets and how did you prioritize those?
Sure. So back a few years ago, Intuit decided that one of the growth legs for the company would be internationalization. At the same time as they were deciding this, there was a competitor coming out of New Zealand. The Kiwis had started to get traction in Australia and the UK. They were following a Commonwealth pattern, obviously, with a lot of the British colonies. And we saw that as a threat. So we saw the opportunity for internationalization and expansion, but we also saw the competitive threat coming out of the Southern Hemisphere. There was a mobilization, which was a declaration we were going to go international. And then the question was, well, what does that mean? QuickBooks Online was our SaaS product in the US. And so my job, I was anointed to go figure out how to do that. So basically the thesis was, well, we've got a SaaS product, it works well for the US, it should work good for the UK or Brazil or France, right? Chris, go figure it out. And so I got the opportunity to build up a product organization all around the world. I spent a lot of time on international flights, which was great at first, less great after 3 years. But it was super fun because it was all, I guess I was an entrepreneur. We had a very small team. We were having to constantly learn from customers, adapt the product, put it back in their hands, adapt it again because we may have missed the mark, et cetera, and keep revving on it until it started to actually get traction in the various markets. And all the markets were very, very different, both in terms of the small businesses we were selling the accounting software to, their relationship with bookkeepers or accountants and how the influence worked. There's a whole series of things, and then you've got all the complexities around accounting standards being totally different in every country. For us, as we looked at it, there was kind of a two-pronged approach. One was go into the easy markets where we see the competitors, so go into to Canada, UK, into Australia, because they're relatively easy. There's similar accounting standards. We'll be able to adapt quickly and get some traction in market. And then the second prong was, hey, there's some really difficult markets out there. Let's take a crack at those. Not believing that we were going to launch the product in 8 months and it would be perfect, but to challenge us and to try and adapt to be able to serve the needs there. And then ideally feed that learning back into the other countries. And so countries like France, that was a really tricky one. I think our initial estimate was 24 months we would have a product. I think they were working on it for 7 years after I left. So they have totally different accounting standards, different relationships with accountants, and it was really tricky. I think one of the things I took away from that experience is never assume your frame of reference is accurate. One of my favorite stories that I had, I flew down to Australia, jumped into Sydney, and went and met with a bookkeeper straight away. So went and chatted with them. They were willing to take the call. I said, hey, I'm with QuickBooks. They said, what the hell's QuickBooks? We don't have that down here. Had to explain the Intuit story and what we do in America, and got to sit down and we do these things. It's a really common pattern at Intuit called follow me homes. And so I got to follow the customer home, not in a creepy way. We go in to learn. And so asked a ton of questions, observed how she was using her existing software, and I started explaining how QuickBooks worked in the States. I said, oh yeah, it's great. There's these checks on the screen, so it's just like when you write a check and you can see it, it's just digitized, so it's a really easy metaphor to understand. Her response to me was, Australia hasn't had checks for like 8 years. Like, you guys are way behind the times. This makes no sense here. And so for me, coming in, I was like, hey, this is brilliant. We've got these checks. It's digital. It'll be easy for someone to understand. My frame of reference was very much North American. And for me, that was a great kind of reset to start saying, okay, I've got to start getting rid of some of my assumptions and start asking more questions to the customers so that I can unlock where those opportunities are. We were very fortunate. We had a lot of really great relationships with our accounting partners, and they were very vocal. So they would tell us what we're doing wrong quite often. So we could harness that insight and support from them to retool the product to try and get it to stick. Great experience. I got to start with, we had about two markets initially, and when I was done after 3 years, we had 7, all at different maturity levels and different size teams in each country. But it was an awesome experience. A small and mighty team that got to help transform into its kind of growth trajectory, and now they're in more markets than even when we started.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I would assume that the QuickBooks product looks different in all 7 different markets. So what was kind of your favorite part about differentiating those and getting to know those markets and the accounting standards and everything that was required to launch QuickBooks in those countries?
So I think if you're a product person, frankly, I think you can apply this to any function. I've been fortunate. I've worked across product management, marketing, as well as customer success. The key thread that goes through every single one of those functional roles, which certainly if you're a startup, you're wearing many hats. You're not getting to pick a specific function quite often, is being customer-centric, always trying to uncover the customer problem, fall in love with that customer problem, and don't just jump to the solution that you think is going to work. And so when I got to go around to all those countries and markets, the problem sets were always different. So sometimes you get a common universal thread, but often there'd be a unique nuance that I got to experience, learn, discover, and then try and understand how I could help that customer, how I could make the product better to serve their needs. So for me, I tend to be inquisitive. I like to learn, and so the best opportunity for going into these different countries was to uncover these kind of hidden gems that would either at least get the product to par and be solving their needs, or hopefully delight them at the end of the day versus just being a parody. So for me, that was something I really enjoyed, and I think one of the assumptions going into it was, hey, QuickBooks Online, it works in the US, it should work everywhere else, or certainly in the Commonwealth countries. And that assumption was flawed because both the customers as well as the market dynamics are not homogeneous. It's heterogeneous, it's different everywhere. And so you have to understand the dimensions and start to unpack what those different nuances are so you can attack those problems. So for me, fall in love with the problem and really getting to dig into that was something that I really enjoyed. It was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that you would have done differently about your experience when you started this whole journey with Intuit and QuickBooks?
That's a good question. So as I think about perhaps doing something differently, one of the areas, at the time, I was actually struggling with entering France and Brazil. They were very difficult markets to enter. In France, their civil laws, they have a totally different accounting standard. And in Brazil, they have a different payment system with the boleto. So it changes even how the fundamental product works. The GM at the time pushed us and said, hey, go into France. When do you think you can deliver this? And we said, oh yeah, maybe 24 months, we'll have it done, no problem. And then as we started to uncover things, we realized this is going to be a giant mess. It's really complicated. You're going to have to redo the whole core engine. In some cases with France, it was a disaster. In terms of our assumptions were incredibly flawed. What I took away from that, and one of my mentors said, he's awesome, he usually cuts to the chase and gives me very direct feedback, said to me, your job is to make the obvious to everyone else. Because quite often for me, the obvious thing was, hey, France is a terrible market to go into. Here's the reasons why. But all the leadership team, they were hell-bent on going into France. And we couldn't convince them otherwise. And I realized that I didn't do a good enough job of advocating and helping people understand the why behind it. And so in large companies, it's quite often you have to be socializing things, you have to be managing expectations, but also helping folks understand your position. And I didn't spend enough time with that. I tended to default to, well, I know because I was there and I talked to these customers and my team said that they've found these 5 things. This doesn't make sense. But I wasn't translating that in a way that was received well by our central leadership team. And so for me, what I realized, and that can apply to any situation, whether it's if you're in a startup and you've got investors or you've got a board that you're working with, helping people see the obvious is really tricky because quite often you're so close to things, you just assume everybody gets it the way you do because it's obvious and it's rational. But quite often you have to spend extra cycles just packaging things up and explaining the details and probably repeating it over and over where it seems like it's way too repetitious for you. It's really critical for it to sink in with other folks. So, minimum 3-4 times they've got to hear it before they actually believe it. So that's one of the things that I learned, which is spend the time on the communications and the engagement and helping people understand the problems versus just, speeding through that because you got to bring people along for that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important lesson for all the entrepreneurs in the room and kind of applying that to their own businesses. And obviously we are at Startup Week, so it's great that we can provide some takeaways for that. So kind of to wrap up your experience with Intuit, what was your favorite customer breakthrough when you were in this globalization process?
There's a few of them. Some of them were no-brainers. One was when you're in Australia, for example, small businesses have a quarterly reporting cycle. There's a standard report they have to create. Our product didn't do it. And so we were able to, in short order, I would say it was 6 months or so, build an entirely different reporting capability to solve that need and allow our teams to start actually selling the product more effectively and drive into the influencer channels. So for me, that was a really proud moment because it was almost like an unlocking. Another one was with accounting software quite often, and it depends on which country you're in, payroll is required. And so you have your standard accounting, but quite often small businesses have employees and you've got to pay them. And so in many countries, payroll was just part of the accounting bundle. We didn't actually have that built for every country because it's very focused on individual jurisdictions. And so instead of building it, we found a partner and we partnered with a third party in Australia that already had a payroll product. And somebody on my team worked with them to reskin it. And so we actually made their product, in essence, like a white label product embedded within ours. So we solved the payroll problem not by building the product, but by redesigning it to make it look like it was harmonized with our core QuickBooks product. So the consumer at the end of the day had no idea that this was happening. But from our perspective, we could accelerate delivering a product that was valuable in country by taking a shortcut and using the existing vendor that was in market, just making it our own, if you will. And that was a really awesome creative solution because we were pressured to deliver the growth in that country really quickly, and we had to solve that specific problem set. And so we looked for a creative solution, and it ended up being very, very successful. I think they might have even just acquired the company at the end of the day. So we were able to skip a whole development cycle for an entirely complex payroll solution. But partnering initially, test driving it, it worked out, and then I think we snapped it up after a few years.
Yeah, so in that product development phase, what advice would you give to any entrepreneurs in the room looking to develop SaaS products, whether or not they're ready to scale those? But with your experience, what advice would you give?
So two things that I shared before: always start with the customer problem. So fall in love with the problems. Don't think that you need to build a widget and the widget's going to be amazing and then fall in love with that widget. Quite often, a lot of folks, as they're developing products, will start to go down a path, get a little bit of feedback, and then start to believe that it is the best thing since sliced bread. Quite often, we're deceiving ourselves. And so I would say keep the customer at the center of everything you're doing and constantly iterate, test and iterate, test and iterate. And it really is important to stay focused. And so one of the areas that, certainly in our organization, we serve a lot of different stakeholders, from little credit unions all the way up to the largest banks in the States. They all have different needs for fraud solutions. But we have to understand those needs to be able to design the products that would be suitable for each customer segment. One of the ways that we have managed all of the, I guess I would say, volume of potential options and solutions we could build is by prioritizing around a very focused cohort of customers. And so one of my favorite things to do is to get really focused on critical few. So I refer to it as critical few. It's something we were trained at Intuit to really focus on. So don't look at all the things you could do. Look at the top 3 things that are going to move the needle, or the key problems that are there, and then go really deep on them. And ideally using a model at Intuit, we refer to it as design for delight, where you go broad, you go narrow, you go broad and narrow. It's really a design thinking framework, but you use that tool to help you really drill down on the most salient critical things, and then move to the development of it. So using rapid prototyping, getting things in front of customers, really trying to unpack the problem set with the customers is critical. Before you get to go down the development cycle, I think quite often we fall in love with what we want to build, and we start to skip steps to try and rush it out the door. And by doing that, you can sometimes miss the mark and waste a ton of time on building something that may or may not be adopted or valuable for the customer. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when you think of that customer problem, it has to deliver the customer benefit, the value to them. And if you can't articulate that or provide that to them, especially in a SaaS world, you have to earn their business every month or every year if you're on an annual cycle with your SaaS product. And so you don't get the opportunity to win them back quite often, right? And so in a box software world, or if you're selling on-prem, you sell it, you keep renewing it. It's difficult to rip and replace. With a SaaS product, it's pretty easy just to hit cancel. It's very much like your apps on your phone, right? The switching costs are low, and people are very, conditioned to be able to cancel things and just bounce. And so, understanding the value, being really focused on the critical few, deliver that value so that you don't have a big churn problem down the road. Because you can fill the bucket as much as you want. If they're leaking out the bottom of it, you're not going to be successful with your growth aspirations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that just in our discussions, we talked about churn was a really, really big deal in all of your experiences. So kind of shifting to your experience in DocuSign, you were responsible for building this customer success model and scaling it from 0 to many. And this was when DocuSign had less than 800,000 subscribers. So this was before anybody would raise their hand and say, yes, I know what DocuSign is in the room. So can you explain what your experience with DocuSign was, kind of how you build that customer success model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had 2 roles at DocuSign. I started with their e-commerce team. So my role was focused on revenue, so more of a marketing and sales role. And it was converting free trial or freemium customers into paid subscribers. When they converted to a paid subscriber, which I hope some of you guys are paid subscribers to DocuSign, we would then focus on retaining customers and keeping them engaged and making sure they've adopted the features so that they didn't churn out. Again, because we were earning our revenue on a monthly basis, and so we didn't want the customers to disappear. So that was one role. The second role that I had was the customer success. So again, defined a problem with the business. We looked at the data, and 98% of all DocuSign customers didn't have any customer success or account managers associated with their account. And the problem with that was we started to look into the data and see what their churn rates were, and we started to look for correlations. What are the drivers of the churn with these customers? One of the data points that we used, which I thought was really powerful, was if a customer were to sign up for DocuSign tomorrow, so you go onto the website, you sign up, if you don't use that product and start sending an envelope, which is the DocuSign envelope you send out for signature, if you don't do that within, I believe it was 3 days, 3 or 5 days, my memory's a little loose now, but your churn potential was like 40% higher than other folks who had actually sent just one envelope within that short period of time. So what that insight helped us understand was we need to focus on adoption, helping the customers onboard and unlock the value. If we do that really quickly in the first few days, we're very likely to retain that customer and hopefully expand them in the future. If we do a really poor job of getting them to onboard, then we're in trouble a year down the way when they go to renew their subscription. And so with customer success, that was the problem set. So we said, okay, how do we solve that? I built a team from the ground up that didn't exist before, where we had customer success managers, which is the traditional enterprise customer success. And then we basically said, okay, that's great. That'll be the one-to-one for enterprise, but for everybody else, how do we solve this? And so I partnered with the data science team, the analytics organization, the marketing team. I actually built my own customer marketing team, as well as the product organization, to start bringing everybody together cross-functionally to say, we have a big problem with adoption. So how do we fix that at scale? So the 800,000 customers, we can actually reach them at the point of need and hopefully get them adopting faster, at a faster velocity, and then on top of it, see a better retention outcome at the end of the day. And so we built a team that was basically looking for signals from the customers. So, for example, the sending of envelopes, we could look at the patterns of envelope sends in the first week of a customer. Anybody that didn't hit a certain threshold, we'd engage them with perhaps an email, might be a phone call outreach if the account was big enough. So we had a whole series of activities we designed, but it was all driven by the signals and the data, and then we could actually leverage that to scale it up and then hit the customers that really needed the additional incremental support. So the team kept retooling that, and it was basically an experimental mindset because we didn't know what we didn't know. And so we were constantly trying new things, testing, experimenting, learning, and then iterating. And the team built a whole bunch of basically automated engagement models that didn't exist previously. I stood that team up in my last year at DocuSign and then departed, but some of the folks that I know that are still running it indicated that they've been able to validate the material impact that team has now made on churn for all customers. They didn't disclose the numbers, but it was big enough that everybody's pretty proud of it. That was a 0 to 1 experience, so it didn't exist. We built it from the ground up. Nobody actually knew what scaled customer success was, and our first name was digital customer success because we didn't know what it was. And we had to really educate the organization, get people excited about the problem, and then rally to focus on how do we move the needle on some of these key metrics so that we can help the business grow and help our customers be successful. So yeah, it was an exciting journey for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what were kind of some of the biggest challenges to getting people to adopt this new customer success model, the subscription of DocuSign, and what challenges did the pushback that you got originally to get people to adopt, and what new challenges did those create for your team as you were developing?
Yeah, so as I reflect on some of the challenges that they encountered, quite often somebody would receive a DocuSign, and then they'd finish signing, and then we'd have a prompt that said, hey, create an account. So we had a lot of people creating accounts that had no idea they had accounts and were unfamiliar with even what they needed to do. Some people would buy a DocuSign subscription when they were signing, and they didn't need to. So we really went on a focused mission to try and educate the customers, both signers and helping them understand the value of a subscription or just even having an account, as well as trying to then bridge them into send your first envelope. And that was really one of the key things. How do you help a customer understand all you have to do is add these contacts, you drag and drop a PDF, a Word doc, and then you can hit send and send this thing out. The whole concept of educating people on that workflow and how it could benefit them was challenging. One of the things we struggled with was DocuSign's used by everybody. And so what industry do you go after? What segment should you target? Real estate was one of our largest. It was almost 40% of our business at the time. So if you ever worked in real estate or worked with a property manager or bought a house or leased, you're probably DocuSigning. But outside of that, there were pockets. And so we started to look at financial services, we would look at healthcare and life sciences, and started to focus our energy on, okay, how can we target some of these specific categories of customer with a use case that matters to them? So if I say, hey, generally, you should DocuSign and go use this for digital signatures or contracts, you're like, yeah, whatever. But if you're, say, an attorney, and we say, hey, attorney, you know what, you should use this as part of your execution of your agreements with your clients. It'll save you 4 hours of cycling emails back and forth and redlining. Okay, now it's in the context of my world, right? So we had to figure out, again, the focus on who are the customers that are going to adopt most easily, create use cases that are valuable and that they care about and will resonate with them. And then with that, we would start to build materials around it. So we actually went from, when we first started, very generic materials and guidance and content to much more tailored, specific content for segments of customers where we were seeing traction. So we just wanted to put more fuel on the fire by tailoring the communications, education, and support for them.
Very cool. So knowing everything that you do right now to this point today, what knowledge would have made that easier for you when you were working with DocuSign?
Well, I don't know if it's knowledge necessarily, but certainly what would have made it easier is that it's redesigning our organization at the time. So one of the things I'm very passionate about, because I've worked in marketing, product management, success, and had blended roles, worked very closely with my different counterparts, I'm a big fan of product-led growth, or PLG. People will hear the acronym PLG all over the place. For me, one of the things I did at DocuSign that I was really passionate about is pulling the product organization in closely to the revenue organization when I was there. So for me, if I wanted to convert a freemium or a trial user for DocuSign, I needed my product partners to find out where the friction was in that trial use flow. And unfortunately, we had different goals. They were focused on, say, billing or something like that. I was focused on converting customers and helping them understand the value of DocuSign. So one of the challenges that I had to overcome was this organizational barrier of different goals. And so for me, one of the things that worked out well was bringing everybody together and driving common OKRs or common goals, where the product team, even though it might not have been on their compensation goals, they felt accountability and partnership with me to solve my problem, which was, hey, I need customers to adopt this product and not drop off in a trial flow. How can you help me with maybe tool tips in the product experience, or trying to embed videos on specific areas where we know people are dropping off, like really trying to unpack that and do some experimentation with the product teams. And so one of the things that I learned in that challenge was you have to be boundaryless. So I imagine many of the startups here know this because you're wearing many hats, you have no choice. But in my case, I was an entrepreneur quite a bit. And so I had to negotiate, get people's buy-in, and ultimately their hearts and minds had to be committed to the common goal. If we didn't have the common goal, it was trouble. So that was one of the challenges, the way we kind of navigated it. It was still imperfect when I moved into a different role, but I'm very passionate about if you can create a common rally cry and a common goal set with different folks, you can start to actually move the needle against stuff. If you have a diversity of goals, things are just going to be messy, and you're probably not going to make as much progress as you will.
Okay, very cool. Very great answers. Okay, so now that you're with Early Warning, what did that transition look like from DocuSign, and kind of how did you get to the role that you have today in product management?
Sure. So I fell into product management, actually fell into marketing probably. So my background, my first degree is in parasitology and zoology, natural transition into marketing, of course, and then product management. And I'm Canadian too, so if I share some weird things like processor, I don't know why. So for me, my journey started with small business. And so I started off with a small firm, and it was basically an advertising agency, and I ended up getting recruited by Intuit because of QuickBooks being a small business offering and me having expertise with small businesses. I started that marketing journey initially, and in that journey, what I realized, and one thing that Intuit is incredible, and if you guys have opportunities to watch videos of different leadership conferences they posted, or some of their leaders sharing philosophies, one of the key areas that is in the DNA of every single individual, whether you're in finance or HR or product, into it is being customer centric and really focusing on customers. And so that's where I got hooked on it with a lot of the marketing activities, right? One of the things that I would always think about is how do I put the marketing materials in customer language, not in Chris Davey Intuit language, using buzzwords and things that are, maybe even MBA speak, but rather in the customer's language and lens, because I'll get a better uptake, I'll get a better conversion rate or whatever it might be. And so that's where the first start I got interested in customers. And then I kind of followed that journey. I stayed in marketing for a while, for about 4 years, and then I got the opportunity to take on a GM or general management role where I had both marketing and product management responsibility. And that was an awesome experience because at that point, what I used to do in marketing is I would point to the product managers and say, your product sucks, that's why I can't sell much. When I became the GM, the only person that I had to point at was me, because I was helping lead the product management roadmap and all the promises that it could deliver, and then I was accountable for the revenue at the end of the day. And so I had to actually bridge the two and make sure that everything we were building transcribed into some sort of business value and customer value so that I could hit our numbers. And so for me, that was a really awesome transition, and probably one of the most challenging parts of my career, because I had to reset an organization, but also one of the most rewarding, because you could rally everybody against common goals and then really move the needle. And then at that point, I was starting to look for other opportunities within Intuit, and this whole globalization thing came up. And it was, again, I fell in love with the problem, which was American company with an American product wants to go worldwide, go figure it out. So that sounds like a really hard problem, really interesting, something I have no idea how to do it, and I got that opportunity to unlock it, and that's how I started my product management journey, was really that thread and that start. That took me through my time at Intuit, and then at DocuSign I wanted to go back to marketing. So I don't know if maybe I'm schizophrenic, I don't know what's going on, but I jump back and forth. I really enjoy solving customer problems, but I also like getting married with revenue. And so you can see the value you create through the output metric of revenue. And so for me, that was really important. So I got to marry the two with DocuSign, working with their revenue team and its success. And then I ended up at Early Warning. I was fortunate that I knew the CEO at Early Warning. He was one of my leaders at Intuit, and he recruited me out. And the pitch was, this organization, which has been around for 30 years and is based here in Scottsdale, is eliminating fraud in payments, transactions, and identity. And I firmly believe, just personally, that identity is going to become an incredible opportunity. And it's a massive challenge currently, because as we digitize all commerce, all interactions, how do you know who somebody is in those interactions? Because you have no more physical interaction. And there's a ton of companies trying to solve it, but Early Warning has 650 million DDA bank accounts in our database. So the way our model works is that all the banks that own us give us data. And they give us data that they will not give anyone else. And so we have this incredible asset to mine and look for opportunities to basically prevent fraud at a scale that no one else in the States can do. There's a whole bunch of challenges with it, because we're regulated, and we also have operating rules that govern the actions that we take. But there's a really interesting opportunity to build almost a unified identity platform. And for me, that's super exciting, because I believe that that's going to be hand in hand with all the digitization going on today. And it's going to be really deeply required to be able to be successful in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess kind of shifting gears, obviously SaaS is not going anywhere and it's grown so large just even in the last 5 years or so. So service companies are coming through, we're building software and we're scaling. How do you see the adoption of AI affecting this, and what kind of technologies are going to make this easier or harder for SaaS companies that are looking to scale?
Yeah, so with SaaS, so as an example, QuickBooks Online and QuickBooks, I got to experience a transition as we started to apply AI even when I was there back many, many years ago. And the concept was bookkeepers go in and help small businesses and they code the transactions, right? Put this transaction in this specific account and map it all. Well, can you imagine just automating that? It's just a rule. It's a rule-based thing. We can just automate that and we can start applying AI to it to predictively say, hey, if we see transactions from Home Depot and you're a contractor, we know that's a business expense. It's just going to go in this specific account. And we started to auto-categorize things for small business owners. And for me, that was like a powerful aha moment where you're taking away low-value work, which is, hey, this transaction goes to this account. It's not high-value work for humans to do, right? It's a simple rule-based effort. Well, we can eliminate that and automate it. And then as you apply AI, you can continually tune it to become more and more accurate. Because of course, when you match things, you're going to have inaccuracy and different challenges, but it'll get better over time. And so as the model's trained and as you see opportunity there, you're eliminating all this low-value work. And so for me, I was excited. If I was a bookkeeper, I'd be nervous. If I was a bookkeeper that thought my job was to code transactions to specific accounts, what I saw was really cool in Australia. They were far advanced beyond where QuickBooks was with Xero. They had worked with bookkeepers and automated a lot of these transactions so that they would just basically hook into the small business bank account and suck in all the transactions, auto-categorize it in less than like 3 minutes. And the accountant or the bookkeeper's job was just to like scan it, maybe change one thing, and done. There were a number of these accountants and bookkeepers that increased their business size by like 3x because we were able to eliminate low-value work. And the bookkeepers that used to do the coding started to actually become, in essence, software consultants. They evolved their role with the small business. And so, while it's scary that, their bread and butter was the coder basically mapping some transactions, we're actually eliminating that low value work out of their role and allowing them to focus on consultation. So now maybe they're doing more consultative conversations with small businesses versus, hey, I just make sure that your accounts are up to date. Because the software can do that. So I really do think that as AI continues to mature, we're going to see increasing opportunities for eliminating low-value work. It'll move up into more complex things over time. And obviously, you guys have seen the news. There's lots of interesting things happening where people are testing it. But at scale, I think where you're going to see the biggest first wave will be in some of that low-value stuff like bookkeeping as an example for me. And it was an aha moment when the bookkeepers were so excited and the accountants were so excited because they also didn't like that work, right? It's not fun work. So if you eliminate that, they were still billing the customers for it. So, which was interesting because quite often the accountants would be like, well, I run your books, it's $1,200 a month or whatever, and now I've just eliminated a whole bunch of wasted time for them. They can now apply it to other things, growing their book of business or adding more clients or whatever. So, yeah, that one was really powerful for me. And that's an example of where I see AI moving, certainly in the short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And it helps startup companies also be able to automate some of this stuff so they don't have to hire somebody who they may be, if they're in the early ages of raising funds and stuff, may not actually be able to afford. So I guess we're getting a time check here, but yeah, last question for you. How do you see AI on your role in early warning, kind of changing that, bumping into the regulations of the big banks? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so all our products are API backend products. So I'll just explain it first before I answer the question because it's a little convoluted, but Basically, the banks give us a bunch of data, so we have all the data. We have a massive database. We take that data, have a crew of data scientists, and they build models, and they're building predictive models. So they're basically trying to take the data and say, what's the likelihood of Chris being Chris, right? If it's an identity use case. And then what we do is we productionalize it into a score, and we'll send that score, and that's our product, to the banks. So a bank, Chris walks into the Bank of America and says, hey, I'd like to create an account. Say it's a teller, says, give me your ID. They type in my information into that, and then what they're doing is they're sending it off and getting early warning services. And then what we do is we return Chris is 85% accurate, or maybe it's 90 or it's 100%, whatever the score is. And so that data and that insight, I see that evolving, whereas we bring more data sources together and we leverage AI. A bunch of our models are actually built on machine learning, and we're trying to tune them, because the more accurate our scores are or attributes about individuals, the more likely we are to prevent the bad guys from getting into the system and help the good guys to open an account faster or to have a loan funded quicker. And so for us, that's where I see it evolving, is speed of constantly tuning our models and ensuring that we increase the accuracy of what we're returning to the banks, which will then benefit consumers and small businesses, because we'll be able to provide them with the financial services that in a lot better time frame.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that affects every single one of us in this room too. So that's really, really good insight. So time-wise, do we have time to open it up? Okay, we don't have time to open it up to questions. But everybody give it up for Chris Davey.
Thank you.